for your presence here today and for the opportunity to be able to sort of host this event today. I did very little with it, so I want to turn it over to Sandy Strauss, who's the one that has worked with Pennsylvania Council of Churches in helping to get all of this coordinated today. But I just wanted to greet you and give you a warm welcome from the church. Thank you.
And I just wanted to say that she has undersold what this church has done in helping us get set up for this. We really appreciate everything that Colonial Park UCC has done. I'm just up here to say that there will be, and many of you have already seen it, books for sale outside in the narthex. If you want to take a look in between this and the panel discussion, Hearts and Minds Books out of Allentown is providing them. All you have to do at this point is fill out a form with all the information about the books, and they will bill you for it. So very trusting, and I trust that you all will not abuse that. But thank you for being here. And now I want to introduce my boss, the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Council of Churches, Reverend Dr. Larry Pickens.
I'm the one who many of you saw take a pratfall not too long ago. Thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Pastor Garris, for the way in which you have made your congregation welcoming and affirming to all of us as we engage in this important conversation. I also want to thank the members of Colonial Park Church for being here. We gathered for lunch earlier, and I would say a good portion of the room, maybe a fourth, maybe more, included members of this congregation. And we're excited about that because we think it's an opportunity for us to be, as a council of churches, more proactive in how we relate to and engage and partner with local churches throughout the state of Pennsylvania. So this is a manifestation of local church engagement and partnership as the Pennsylvania Council of Churches engages significant topics for dialogue and strategy. Robert Jones, our speaker today, helps in forging this kind of significant conversation. Robert Jones is the CEO and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, and I understand you're about to take another role now as transitions are occurring within the organization, and he has been very important in writing columns on politics, culture, and religion for Atlantic Online. He's featured in major media such as CNN, MSNBC, NPR. He's the author of The End of White Christian America and White Too Long, and as he shared with us at lunch today, he is preparing to publish another book in the near future. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University, a Master of Divinity from Southwest Baptist Theological Seminary. And I think that what has always impressed me about what Robert does is that he takes complex information and is able to interpret it in a way that allows all of us to understand what is critical as we look at issues that impact the life of the church. Our subject today is titled Christianity, Sacred or Supremacist. It gets at the heart of the white Christian nationalist movement in our country, around which I would suggest there are two pillars undergirding it: white supremacy and the pursuit of power. I would also suggest that tangent movements such as Christian identity churches and America First also have at their root the exclusion of others, particularly black, brown, immigrant, Jewish people, and also represents misogyny. Recently, I participated in an editorial board conversation about Christian nationalism where I heard it said that Jesus had a mission that was grounded in love. The faith is about redemption and should be about inclusion. And our mandate is love and not amassing power. Defining white people as a chosen race and othering those who do not fit into this understanding of chosenness at the exclusion of others is antithetical to our faith. Racism is a blight on our national landscape, and it challenges even our ability to create community. When Tocqueville came to this country in the 19th century and ultimately produced Democracy in America, he reflected upon the religious fervor of its people, and he also raised a caution. He cautioned that white and black people could never coexist in America. It reflected a general idea that pervaded throughout the country that black people should ultimately be repatriated or encouraged to immigrate to other countries in Africa or the Caribbean, where black people were the majority. I think Tocqueville put his finger on something that still haunts our nation today. Can we live and thrive in a democracy where pluralism grounds our social fabric? Can we have a faith that is not racist and exclusive? These are questions that bring us together today. And it is our honor that we have this opportunity to have this community building opportunity that Dr. Martin Luther King called the beloved community. Thank you for your presence and your willingness to join in this conversation and what it calls us to do in our churches, communities, and world. I invite you to hear our brother Robert Jones as he comes to present at this time.
Well, good afternoon. Glad to see you all here. Some of you I've already talked to at lunch, others just joining us. So I'm so happy to be here with you. I'm happy to be giving this talk in a church. We're going to talk a lot about this phenomenon of Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism. What does that mean? How's it affecting the country today? And this title, I think, gets at it: Christianity in America, Sacred or Supremacist? And I'm going to start with this idea, get this nice little tapestry here over the pulpit. of maybe using that as a metaphor of thinking about the country, right? That we have, you think about the culture of the country as this kind of tapestry that's been woven, and every generation gets to contribute its part, right? It starts coming off the loom as each generation departs. So you can kind of see their contributions to it. This vision is this long thing. And I would submit to you that we actually in this country have two competing and incompatible templates. That have kind of, you can see the dissonance in the tapestry that's been created from former generations of Americans. On the one hand, we have this idea of a democracy, right? A pluralistic democracy where everybody stands on equal footing before the Constitution and the law. This clarification process began pretty early on. For example, George Washington, our first president, received a letter from a synagogue saying, hey, do we have to be Christian in order to be citizens? And Washington wrote back and said, no. The only things required is your assent to the laws, right? That makes you a full and full citizen along with everyone else. But we do have this other tradition that we're hear a lot about today, and that is America as a Christian nation, this claim about its Christian origins. And I would submit to you that one of the things that's always been true, and we've never quite resolved the tension between these two competing and incompatible claims. So part of what I'm going to highlight, I think, today is how this claim of the country being a white Christian country has come to reside and be supported by Christianity, and not just kind of fringe forms of Christianity, but kind of mainstream forms of Christianity. So I'll be reflecting some of what I wrote in White Too Long. The full title of that book is The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. And I'm going to start with the personal with that book. And this page here is actually a scan of our family Bible. So one of the most prized possessions I have from my mother's side of the family is the family Bible. You probably can't quite make it out on the screen there, but it was published in 1815. And it was handed down. It was actually handed down mother to daughter until my mother handed it to me as I went to seminary in my early 20s. But many of you may have a Bible like this. In between the Old and New Testament, if you're a Christian, your family comes from a Christian tradition, there were traditionally these genealogical pages, births, deaths, marriages, etc., that got kind of, and you can see that's these outlines here from my family's family tree, and some of the earliest records we have are actually from this family Bible that has 3 generations of families beginning books published in 1815, but some of the dates actually go back into the 1700s that are recorded here in the Bible. The person who owned this Bible, his name was Pleasant Moon. Now that sounds kind of fanciful. It was actually a male British name. There's several generations of Pleasant Moons on my mother's side of the family. Came down, some from Virginia, actually some into Bucks County, Pennsylvania before going down to Virginia, ultimately settling in Georgia. So I kind of knew this part of my family's history. And again, this is one of our oldest, most prized possessions on that side of the family. Recorded here are several generations of Pleasant Moons, also Baptist preachers, the founder of Dexter Memorial Baptist Church in Middle Georgia. But all of these families basically lived in 1 or 2 counties in Middle Georgia, around Macon, Georgia. In fact, my siblings and I are the first generation in 200 years not to live in either Bibb County or Twiggs County, Georgia, on my mother's side of the family. So long standing thing here. I vaguely knew that also alongside those Baptist preachers and farmers and others, that there were Confederate soldiers in this line as well. And there was even some acknowledgement that there may have been enslaved people here as well. But as I began to do some genealogical research, I also turned up this document. So this is an estate settlement from actually my Pleasant Moon's great uncle, who was also named Pleasant Moon. He died in the same year the Bible was printed. So he dies in 1815, same year the Bible's printed. And this is an estate settlement, and it lists everything. Like, it's got 6 chairs, 1 feather bed, 1 table, 1 bay mare, 6 head of sheep, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, like all the way down. But when I pulled this up on Ancestry.com and was able to actually get a digitized copy of it, I noticed that intermingled and actually one of the most valuable objects on this list were 4 human beings. Right? 1 Negro woman named Naomi at $800. 1 named Susan at $450. 1 named Eliza at $275. 1 named Bird, a boy, at $150. So along with the tables and the chairs and the beds were human beings, right, with monetary values assigned to them. In addition to them just being there in this list, it turns out that they made up 72% of the assets of this family. Now, my family was not don't picture Gone with the Wind, right? My family was not the kind of massive 1,000-acre, or 2,000-acre plantation-owning family. In fact, our family received only 200 acres in a land lottery in the early 1800s in Georgia. Free land, if you were from European descent, to come down from Virginia and take land that had very recently been freed up from the forced removal of the Cherokee in Georgia. Now, I didn't know that part of the story either, but I began to think, okay, what does it mean, right, to have this legacy of preachers, right, Christians who would treasure this Bible? This is the only thing that survives in my family's side that's that old, right? That this is the thing that they treasured and handed down. There's evidence in this Bible of some flood damage. So somebody rescued it from a flood at some point and tried to repair it as best they could. And it comes down for 200 years through the side of the family. What does that mean, that kind of Christian heritage, all wrapped up with enslaving other people, right? And apparently with no contradiction in any of these things. So I really, the genesis of the book was really my trying to sort out where does white supremacy end and my Christian identity begin? And how do I know, having been raised in this world? It was particularly pointed because not only because of this family history, but I grew up as a Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi for the most part. We moved from Georgia over to Jackson, Mississippi. And, I always knew we were a part of a Southern Baptist church, but I always assumed that word Southern was a just compass point, right? Geographic descriptor of the fact that we were in Mississippi. That's what the word Southern meant there. It wasn't until I was in seminary, actually in my early 20s, that I finally had a Baptist history professor tell me the truth about the genesis of our denomination. And it was this. This is actually the first sentence from the book. The Christian denomination in which I grew up was founded on the proposition that chattel slavery could flourish alongside the gospel of Jesus Christ. Its founders believed this arrangement was not just possible, but also divinely mandated. And then to note that denomination that split from the Northern Brethren over the issue of slavery and insisting on the propriety and indeed even the Christian virtue of enslaving other people based on the color of their skin became, by the middle of the 20th century, the largest expression of Christianity in the country. All right, the Southern Baptist Convention became the largest denomination in America by the 1950s. And so what does that mean, right? Not only my family, but this is like the Christian tradition in which I was raised. So, I began to kind of try to sort this out. And one of the striking things that I noticed, having gone through, I have a seminary degree, I have a PhD in religion, and still really was largely ignorant, I think, of many of these roots and entanglements of Christianity. And one of the things I began to see as I began to kind of re-educate myself a bit and do my own kind of research about this is how out there testimonies about this entanglement were, particularly from Christians of color. Right? This was no mystery to Christians of color here, and that we've just systematically ignored most of these really indictments, is what you would call them. So here's Frederick Douglass, 1845, right? In his first autobiography. I had actually been assigned to read this book in graduate school, but I was not assigned to read the appendix. And the appendix is where he spends multiple pages just excoriating the practice of white Christianity. in the country. And this is just a small excerpt of it, but it's just heartrending. Between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. We have men sold to build churches, women sold to support the gospel, and babes sold to purchase Bibles for the poor heathen, all for the glory of God and the good of souls. The slave auctioneer's bell and the church-going bell chime in with one another, and the bitter cries of the heartbroken slave are drowned in the religious shouts of his pious master. He goes on to write that it was common knowledge among enslaved people that the worst fate that could befall them, other than being enslaved, was being enslaved to a white Christian master. And the reason for this, he said, is that they were known to be more cruel, that they had biblical justification for the practice of slavery. And it actually ended up dulling their compassion and dulling their consciences in a way that they could be brutal and crueler, more cruel than non-Christian masters. Like, this was common knowledge, right? That among enslaved people in Douglas's circle. Here's Martin Luther King. Now, in the churches I grew up in, I was in high school in the 1980s when Martin Luther King's birthday was first recognized. And our church kind of made, I think, a paltry attempt in the 80s to at least acknowledge that in some way. Although in Mississippi, to this day, it is still officially recognized on the same day that Martin Luther King is Robert E. Lee's birthday. Still both recognized by the state in Mississippi. And so there was some of that going on, but there was some reading, and it was always one of the things from the I Have a Dream speech, one of the kind of nice things from the I Have a Dream speech. I would really love it if every white Christian church in the country stopped reading anything from I Had a Dream and would read Letter from Birmingham Jail in its entirety on Martin Luther King Sunday. Like, that would be a much more appropriate, I think, use of King in a white Christian church. But here are just a couple of lines from that. He says, "A few years ago, I felt we would be supported by the white church. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained," here this phrase is, I think, just so insightful, "and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing power of stained glass windows." So here's James Baldwin. So this is actually the quote from which the title of the book comes, White Too Long, actually comes from this quote from Baldwin. So, as many of you may know, Baldwin, I think, was remarkable, I think, for really refusing to dip his pen in the well of hatred, right? Despite being angry, despite being hurt at what he saw white Americans. I think he, like King, held out some dim hope that at some point white Christians in particular would step up en masse and join the freedom movement, the civil rights movement. But he writes this in 1969, really in a state of despair after the assassination of both Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. Just a few months prior. And so this is from a New York Times op-ed that he writes. I just found this so arresting. He says, "I will flatly say that the bulk of this country's white population has impressed me, or impresses me, and has so impressed me for a very long time as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long." Now he continues, "They have been married to the lie of white supremacy too long. The effect on their personalities, their lives, their grasp of reality has been as devastating as the lava which so memorably immobilized the citizens of Pompeii. They are unable to conceive that their version of reality, which they want me to accept, is an insult to my history and a parody of theirs, and an intolerable violation of myself." Despite these kind of testimonies, from the 19th century all into the 20th century, the other thing that became so apparent is I did some research, just kind of my family's lineages and what churches did they go to. My family's connected to First Baptist Church of Macon, Georgia, and it turns out there are two First Baptist churches in Macon, Georgia, one predominantly white, one predominantly black. They used to be the same church. They began in 1820 with white people bringing enslaved people to church with them forcibly on a Sunday morning. And the original church building actually had a separate gallery for enslaved people to sit. So they didn't sit with white people in the church. This is a picture here of a slave gallery. This is actually, and I think I picked this picture because it's actually not in the South. This is actually St. Augustine's Church in New York. And it's a slave gallery. This is the current minister sitting there looking out. And you get a sense of how far back it is. You also get a sense of the openings were usually fairly closed, which meant that sort of enslaved people could see out, but white people had a hard time seeing in, right? So you couldn't actually see enslaved people very well, kind of up in this darkened balcony on high. But if we take this seriously as a common way that churches were organized, not just in the South, but all over during the practice of chattel slavery, you have to start asking yourself, okay, this is the way that early white Christian churches were formed. But if that's the kind of service and that's what was brought into the sanctuary, it has a deep, deep shaping effect on what could be preached, right, in those settings, right? You might preach about slaves obeying your masters, but you're probably not going to preach that in Christ there is no slave nor free, right? No Jew nor Greek, right? You're not going to preach that probably in this service. What scripture could be read, what hymns could be sung, what prayers could be prayed, all of it shaped around this presumption of white supremacy. And we have to kind of think about that as the way that early Christianity in this country was really shaped generation after generation after generation. So the other thing, that I do in my day job is look at public opinion data. And one of the things I want to do in the book is not only isolate this history of the entanglement of white supremacy and Christianity throughout history, but to ask the question about how this is with us still today. So I'm going to show you a few data points here. I think they may be a little bit hard to read, particularly in the back, so I'll walk you through them. The numbers aren't as important as the patterns. You'll still be able to see the patterns, I think, on the bars. So I set out in the book and devised this thing I called the Structural Racism Index, which is a set of about a dozen questions that ask various things about structural racism, the impact of past discrimination, slavery on the present, the treatment of African Americans by police, the criminal justice system, Confederate monuments and flags, et cetera, et cetera. It covers a lot of ground. But all these questions actually, it turns out, correlate quite highly together. And so I combined them into one big measure to try to isolate the patterns. And what I wanted to look at is the subgroups of white Christians that exist in the country, along with whites who are not Christian. Because what I really wanted to see is that what work does Christianity do on attitudes of racism, right? So by comparing whites who are not Christian to various kinds of whites who are, I can kind of get a sense of what difference this makes. So I'm not going to go through all dozen questions, but I'm going to give you a handful here. So here's a typical question from the Racism Index. It's an agree or disagree question. The bars here are people who disagree with the following statement. Generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for blacks to work their way out of the lower class. Those who disagree, it's nearly 7 in 10 white evangelical Protestants disagree, but so do more than 6 in 10 white mainline Protestants, and a majority, nearly 6 in 10 white Catholics disagree with that statement. But if I look at whites who are religiously unaffiliated, that's the one that drops, right? It's only 40% of whites who are not Christian, who claim no religious affiliation, that agree. And then the bottom one here, I have African American Protestants up as kind of a reference point. So you can see where African American Protestants are. About a third disagree with this statement. Now, just a bit more about these groups, because I'm going to keep the same groups up on several slides. So white evangelicals are kind of my people. Southern Baptists is the largest representation of that group. White evangelical Protestants. They tend to be more anchored in the South. than elsewhere in the country. White mainline Protestants is a term sociologists sometimes use to really talk about the non-evangelical Protestant side of Christianity. Think the National Council of Churches, the Pennsylvania Council of Churches, United Methodists, Episcopalians, United Church of Christ, Presbyterian, etc., in that group. And then there are white Catholics. And white mainline Protestants are a little more Midwest and upper Northeast in their orientation. White Catholics tend to be more urban and more Northeastern as well, and they're and to a greater extent now in the West and Southwest as well, but mostly white Catholics in the Northeast. And then white religiously affiliated are actually quite spread here. So that's the groups that I'm talking about. So there's the pattern. But you'll see that white Christians, right, are all kind of in one place. Whites who are unaffiliated look quite different. Here's a question about Confederate flags and monuments. This question is about people who see Confederate flags and monuments to be more a symbol of Southern pride than a symbol of racism, right? So they're on the Southern pride side of this. It is more than 80% of white evangelicals think that about both Confederate monuments and flags. White mainline Protestants, it is 70% say that about flags, more than 80% say that about monuments. White Catholics, identical to white mainline Protestants. And then you see the drop, right, of whites who are religiously unaffiliated, not Christian. You see the much lower levels, African-American Protestants on the bottom, even lower. One more, you'll see the very similar thing. This one's closer to contemporary issues we've been talking about, and that is police killing of unarmed African-Americans, right? So this question, these are the people who believe that the killing of unarmed African-Americans by police are just isolated incidents, rather than part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans. So people who believe these are just isolated incidents. Here are all white Christian groups. Again, 70% of white evangelicals, nearly 6 in 10 white mainline Protestants and white Catholics. You ask about whites who are unaffiliated, it drops down about a third, and less than 1 in 5 African American Protestants. So basically this pattern showed up again and again across like 12 different questions like this. But this gives you a sense of it. When I combine all 12 of them, you get this pattern, and it's a little bit washed out up there, but I think you can still basically see what happens. The first 3 curves is the distribution, may help a little bit, is the distribution pattern of answers for white evangelicals, white mainline Protestants, and white Catholics. You see they're basically very, very similar in shape. There's a median line that goes through it, and basically one way of thinking about this is if you scored as a composite measure like 0 to 10, where 10 is holding the most racist attitudes, 0 is holding the least racist attitudes, what you find is that white evangelicals on this composite score 8 out of 10, right, toward the high end of that scale. But maybe the surprising thing, that may not be that surprising given their Southern roots, but perhaps the surprising thing is that white mainline Protestants and white Catholics each scored about 7 out of 10 on this scale. So not that far, a little further down, but not that far. And if you compare that to white religiously unaffiliated, non-Christian folks, they only scored 4 out of 10. And it's a little washed out on the slide, but basically the distribution skews farther to the left. It doesn't skew to the right. So even the shape of it is quite different, but the composite scores are 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10, 7 out of 10 among white Christians, only 4 out of 10 among white religiously unaffiliated people. So what it suggests, right, is just in the correlational data, that if you basically take your average white person in America and you add Christian identity, they move up the racism index and not down, right? That's what this basically indicates. Now, all of you who have had a statistics class will recognize, right, that the thing you always say, the mantra is correlation is not causation, right, is the thing you always hear from, and that is true. So it took a little more step to kind of figure out, because there could be alternative explanations, right? It could be that that Southern regional identity makes a difference. It could be that partisanship makes a difference, that white Christians are more likely to be Republican, for example. It could be generational, could be average age. There could be all kinds of other education levels, other kinds of alternative explanations. So what it is, I put these into a statistical model where I could hold all of that stuff constant, right? So in these models, I'm controlling for things like partisanship, age, education level, region, gender, et cetera, and holding all those kind of things constant. What is the independent connection between white Christian identity and those scores on the racism index, and tendency to score higher on the racism index. And so this chart basically shows you what happens. You can think about it like this. Think about a volume knob, and I am taking scores on the racism index, and I'm starting at 0, and I'm turning them all the way up to 10, right? And just taking that volume, so moving up the racism index. What happens to the likelihood of identifying as white and Christian as I move that knob from 0 to 10? That's the way you're going to read this chart. And it turns out that the answer could be nothing, right? You could turn it all the way up to 10, and if there's no independent relationship between kind of racist views and white Christian identity, nothing would happen. It could be negative. You could turn this up, and likelihood of white Christian identity could go down. But it turns out that the likelihood of white Christian identity of various kinds goes up about 20 percentage points, even controlling for all this stuff. So it tells you there's an independent and significant relationship between the racism index and identifying as white and Christian. So in other words, the way we read this chart, the first one, what happens to white mainline Protestants as you go from 0 to 10? The likelihood of identifying as mainline Protestant goes up 18 percentage points, even controlling for all those other factors. For white evangelical Protestants, it's 19. For white Catholics, it's 20 percentage points. They're almost identical, right, once you control for region and other kinds of things. Notably, the relationship between holding more racist attitudes among whites who are not Christian is negative. It goes the other direction, right? So this tells you that there's something about Christian identity that is independently connected to holding racist views, and it's not just a function of some other variable here. That was a fairly shocking finding. The other piece here that I think, I talked about this in the luncheon meeting, but one of the most heartrending things I found was that how church does and doesn't matter on this question. Because, you could say, well, okay, those are people who identify as Christian, but maybe they're not connected to churches, so they don't hear sermons, they're not in Bible studies, they're not part of Christian communities that help shape their views. So I decided to look at church attendance and see exactly what happens. Like, how much difference does it make if one attends church a lot more or a lot less? It turns out that for white mainline Protestants and white Catholics, church attendance basically makes no difference. That is, those who attend more highly than others have about the same likelihood of scoring high on the racism index as those who attend less frequently. But it does make a difference for white evangelical Protestants, but in the opposite direction, as you might hope. And that is that this top line, the steeper curve, is actually frequent church attenders. Those attend weekly or more. And you'll see the steep curve, and the x-axis here is moving from the least racist to the most racist on the racism index from 0 to 10. So again, as you kind of turn that knob up, what happens is the likelihood of being a high attending white evangelical goes up. And you can see this flatter curve on the bottom is infrequent church attenders, right? So it makes less difference among infrequent church attenders, but among those who attend highly, among white evangelicals, attending church actually makes it more likely that they're going to score higher on that racism index. And again, this is with controls in place for all kinds of, like partisanship and other educational factors are all being controlled for here in this chart. I mean, it led me to a couple of fairly disturbing insights. I mentioned this idea that this confirms that idea that if you take your average white American and you add Christian identity, they move up. It means for evangelicals, church attendance actually makes them also more likely to score higher on the racism index. And I kind of tried to boil it down. What does this really mean in like common vernacular layperson's terms without all the math? And it basically means this, that if you were recruiting for a white supremacist cause on a Sunday morning and you wanted to be as efficient as you could possibly be in recruiting people, statistically, you would have better luck hanging out in an average white church parking lot waiting for services to let out than you would be approaching whites in the local coffee shop who are sitting out the services. That's what it means. Now, when I got clear about that, I remember I was writing the book and I was kind of looking at the numbers. I had those numbers checked like 4 times. And when I realized they were right, I just remember having to just push back from the desk and like take a walk. Like I just was done for the day. And these are my people, right? This is my family that this is true about. And, I begin to, I think when you see it confronted with this, you sort of think, oh, how can this be? I mean, this was kind of my first reaction, was like, well, how can this be? But, the clearer I got about the history, again, the beginning of the beginning of my denomination, those testimonies of Baldwin and King and others I haven't even mentioned, Cone and Thurman, and so many others, right, talking about how white Christianity has just been entangled in white supremacy. That question shifted from kind of how can this be really to kind of like, oh, well, like how could this be otherwise given that history, right? And I think this is one of the things we're still trying to sort ourselves out from. I'm going to shift over a little bit to this question on my way toward closing to that's white supremacy, which I think is really at the heart of it, right? We have this newer term that's been floating around the last few years, white Christian nationalism, that I think is the current political manifestation of this much older problem that we have in the country. But here's like a way to kind of get to the heart of the matter. This is from a poll that PRRI did last year, and it basically just is an agree or disagree question. And we decided to try to just go straight at it in a survey question, just kind of put it in there. Do you agree or disagree with this? So the question reads, God intended America to be a new promised land where European Christians could create a society that would be an example to the rest of the world, right? So a promised land for European Christians, kind of at the heart of this kind of divinely ordained promised land for European Christians, kind of at the heart of this question. And we found out that 3 in 10 Americans actually agree with that statement. So it's rejected by 2 to 1. More than, twice as many Americans reject this proposition than accept it. But if you start looking at like partisan breakdowns, religious breakdowns, you start to see it actually has some traction in particular circles. So first of all, here's those first 4 bars are the same ones that I've had up on those other slides. It's white evangelical Protestants, white mainline Protestants, white Catholics, white religiously unaffiliated. The ones who really jump out here are white evangelical Protestants. A majority of white evangelical Protestants agree with that statement. It's only a little more than a third of white mainliners, 37% of white Catholics, but only 12% of whites who are religiously unaffiliated. It's also a majority of Republicans who agree with that statement. 53% compared to only 18% of Democrats. It's 51% of political conservatives compared to only 10% of political liberals. And you can really see the media impact here. Those who trust Fox News is 52%, who say that Fox News is the most trusted source of television news. Those who trust even networks out to the right of Fox, OAN, Newsmax, and others, 2/3 agree with this statement, and compared to only 25% who trust mainstream news. It's also highly correlated with QAnon here as well. And I think perhaps the most chilling or worrisome finding about this is that it is highly correlated with other ideas like you may have heard this kind of debate about the great replacement theory, right? That immigrants are replacing real Americans. It's highly correlated with that question, but probably the one that is the most disturbing that it's connected to is it's also highly correlated with the acceptance of violence in political space. Right, so for example, people who agree with, Americans who agree with that statement, that God intended America to be a new promised land for European Christians, are 4 times as likely as those who disagree to say true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country, right? And it's almost half of that group also affirms this problem with violence. Now, we've seen some of this actually take shape in the country. So these are both images from January 6th, from the attempted insurrection in January 6th. One of the things you will note in this one to the left, I did not set this up, but like my church growing up, these 2 flags, right, that are on either side of me right now, and that were on the pulpit of the church I grew up in, and probably the ones that many of you grew up in, the Christian flag and the American flag, they're both in this frame, right, from here. And if you saw the video that the House Select Committee showed of clips from January 6th, the last frame, which went by without a lot of comment actually, but the last frame in that video are people standing on the barricades waving two flags. One of those flags is a Trump flag. The other one is that flag that's being waved on those barricades. And so it's pretty evident that this mix, right, of Christianity and nationalism, this claim, and you know, the other flag that's not in here though, that was so much, that there's also video footage of, many of you seen the Confederate flag, right, being marched into the breach Senate chamber, and right behind it also came this flag into the breach Senate chamber, the Christian flag. So this is like deeply, deeply with us today, and I think something we've got to take very seriously about how these things have been intertwined here. In terms of churches, I'm going to say just a couple things in closing, and then I'm going to close here. Just two things about how this has gone. I think that there's two moments that we've got before us, I think, is for those of us in this room who are white and Christian. One of them is we really do have to figure out how to tell the truth about our past. This is like vital. It's not only vital for other people, it's vital for us to know who we are and how we got here. And we really can't pretend. I think white Christians are so quick to sort of want to just put our arms around each other and have us all sing Kumbaya and everything's good, right? And let's just not talk about the past. Let's just move forward. But I really do think it's incumbent, not just for the sake of others, but for the sake of ourselves, to really tell the whole truth about kind of how we got here, and that we really aren't going to get to healing for anyone, ourselves included, without being willing to be honest and tell the whole truth about our past. The other word that white Christians love to use is reconciliation. I think this is what a lot of stuff has marched under: reconciliation committees, reconciliation movements, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to step on too many toes, but I would also love to see white Christians stop talking about reconciliation and only talk about repairing the damage, right? And if we did that, I think if we white Christians focused on the repair piece of this thing, I'm pretty sure our black and brown brothers and sisters would tell us when we're reconciled, right? We would arrive there at some moment, and we would all know it, right? So it's not something actually I think we even have to aim at, right? If we aimed at repair, we would get to reconciliation here. So I'm going to close with just a couple of words before we move to the next part. If we think back, this has a long tail. It's really been 500 years when the first Europeans, a little bit more actually, landed on these shores. So it's been over 160 years since the abolition of slavery. But we saw this combination of social forces and demographic changes that have brought us again to a moment of reckoning. And at this moment, I think we white Christians have got to find the courage to face the fact that the version of Christianity that our ancestors built, the faith of our fathers, as the hymn celebrates it, was a cultural force that by design protected and propagated white supremacy. We've inherited this tradition with scant critique, and we have a moral and religious obligation to face the burden of that history and its demand on our present. And we have to accept that given the way in which white supremacy has burrowed its way into our Christian identity, that refusing to address this sinister disorder in our faith will continue to generate serious negative consequences, not just for our fellow Americans, but for ourselves and our children. Inaction is a tacit blessing on white supremacy's continued presence as a Christian habit and virtue. If we're willing to finally live into the fullness of the promise of liberty and justice for all Americans, we're going to have to recover from our white supremacy-induced amnesia. It's difficult, at times overwhelming, to confront historical atrocities, especially when they're personal, about our families. But if we want to root out an insidious white supremacy from our institutions, our religion, and our psyches, we're going to have to move beyond the forgetfulness and the silence that have allowed it to flourish for so long. And importantly, as we white Christians find the courage to embark on this journey of transformation, we're going to discover, I think, that the beneficiaries are not only our country and our fellow non-white and non-Christian Americans, but also ourselves as we slowly recover from the disorienting madness of white supremacy. And I think this last point's really only beginning to dawn on us white Christians. We still too easily believe that racial reconciliation is the goal, that it may be achieved through a straightforward transaction, white confession in exchange for black forgiveness. But mostly this transactional concept is a strategy for making peace with the status quo, which is a very good deal indeed if you were white. I'm not going to try to, I'm really not trying to be cynical, but merely honest about how little even well-meaning whites we have believed that we have something at stake in racial reconciliation efforts. Whites, and especially white Christians, almost without exception, have seen this project as an altruistic one, rather than a desperate life or death struggle for our own future. What few whites perceived, and this is true, that has come late to me, is that we have far more at stake than our black fellow citizens in setting things right. Baldwin provocatively put it that the civil rights movement began when an oppressed and despised people began to wake up collectively to what had happened to them. But the question today for those of us who are white and Christian is whether we will also waken to see what has happened to us and to grasp once and for all how white supremacy has robbed us of our own heritage, of our ability to be in right relationships with our fellow citizens, with ourselves, and even with God. Reckoning with white supremacy for us is now an unavoidable moral choice. And I'm going to give the last hopeful word, I hope it's hopeful, to James Baldwin from The Fire Next Time. It really does come down simply to a couple of things. Whether we white Christians are going to be willing to just do the simple things of telling the whole truth and loving all of our neighbors. If we can do this, we might just still, in Baldwin's words, quote, end the racial nightmare, achieve our country, and change the history of the world. Thanks.
I think we have a little time for a few questions for Rob or comments that you'd like to make, and then we'll shift into the panel. Yes? I can take cards if people have questions. Oh, okay. Put your hand up if you have a card with a question. There's one right there.
All right, and give them to me. I can take the easy ones. All right. I think I can make these out. All right. Good? All right, I'll take the first. All right, all this is shocking but not surprising. Don't have my glasses. Theology ultimately matters. How can Christianity in any form separate itself from this form of supremacy when the central theological story is based on a salvation event that is available only to a limited group? God so loved humanity that God gave God's only Son as an act of love, available only to those who become a Christian or in the predetermined version, and then whom God chose to include. God's love is unlimited through grace, but available only to a limited group. This ultimately leads to a great a deal of self-entitlement and low recognition of humanity, the outgroup. How can Christianity proclaim otherwise ever? So it's an interesting question. I do think theology matters. I think mostly I do have seminary degrees, have some theological training, but I think the sociological training and the historical training and historical read really have kind of led me to, painfully see just how malleable Christian theology has been, right? Bent almost infinitely to any form. When I was doing research for White Too Long, I did realize that even Douglas, right? Between the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity of America, I see the greatest possible distance. And even the abolitionists, I think many abolitionists actually feared, for example, that those supporting enslaving other people actually had the better biblical argument. Could quote chapter and verse, right? Both from the Old Testament and the New Testament to support, their positions. And they realized they'd have to do a different kind of thing. They couldn't out-proof text those. They had to kind of argue more on principle, right? And kind of create a frame to read the text through. And so I think that's important. And I think the chosenness, I think this question actually gets to the chosenness piece. There's certainly versions of Christianity that are more universalistic than others, and teachings of heaven and hell and all of that stuff, more or less inclusive and are de-emphasized. But I do think the idea of chosenness has done us a great deal of harm, right? That we end up with, that's really what's embedded in that question, right? That and this idea, again, it's the version of Christianity that lands on these shores, are this idea that Europeans, right, have a divine mandate to conquer the world, right? The other non-Christian peoples of the world. This is embedded, again, we were talking over here, in this thing called the Doctrine of Discovery, all the way back to a papal edict in 1493, right? And that's the version of Christianity that we get. This is before the Protestant Reformation, right? So it's all in the Western world, all Catholic, and that's the version that lands here. And this idea, a new Zion, a promised land, manifest destiny, like all of these concepts, right, are connected to that vision of what Christianity is in the world. And that Doctrine of Discovery had these two twin concepts that it was justified because what Europeans were bringing to the pagans, the savages, whatever, barbarians, other kinds of words that were used to describe everyone else in the world, was they were bringing European civilization and Christianity. And there were always soldiers and missionaries, right, together, like weapons and the Bible. And a common practice, all the way from whether the French colonizers, the Spanish colonization, always had some version of not only a kind of political edict read to native or indigenous people, but they would often erect like a 30-foot cross, right, in the middle of the village, right, as this sign of dominance. And Christianity played a huge role in that. So let me get a couple more.
Want me to conflate those?
Yeah, why don't you, that'd be great.
Here's a question for you on repair. And simply, can you say a little about this idea of repair, or I guess reparation?
Yeah. Repair, yeah. The question is about, say a little bit more about the idea of repair. So in the last chapter of the book, I tried to think about what does this look like on the ground and try to look at communities that were actually trying to do this. I mentioned this church, First Baptist Church of Macon, Georgia, that had this shared history with this predominantly black church that had this very fraught history. But what happened is after the Civil War, the two churches separated, right? And African Americans received their own church. And then for basically 150 years, the two churches sat in very close proximity to one another. Like today, you can see one steeple from the other. Like you could throw a golf ball from one parking lot to the other, and there's a park actually, and they sit like this. There's a park up here that they're both adjacent to. But for 150 years, they pretended like each other didn't exist. Like there was literally no contact between these two churches sitting that close together and with this shared history. And it was 2014, I think, as when the two churches actually got new pastors in close succession to one another. And they finally got together and just said, like, what are we doing, right? And decided to try to build some community here between the two churches. Now, that meant, I think, more work on the white side of that equation than on the African American side because of this history, but the predominantly white church is willing to do it. And so they started looking into their own history, including that early shared history together, discovered some fairly difficult things to deal with, which the pastor preached on. So for example, they found that before they separated, that the practice again was for white people to bring enslaved people to church with them, and they were on the membership rolls, right? So the African Americans were on the membership rolls, marked as enslaved people in the official rolls. And the church went through a financial downturn. It was like in the 1840s, and in order to balance the books, they sold their own members, right? And there's a ledger in the church where there is the sale of enslaved people and money coming in, and on the other side of the ledger, there's that money going to pay the pastor's salary, the mortgage on the building, other materials for the church, and bills for the church, right? And that's part of the history. And the pastor actually brought that forward and preached on that history, right? And in the church as a way of kind of helping them all deal with it. It's led to tell a couple of other stories in the church, but I think it's, they're not trying to remerge the churches, but they are trying to build community, right, and repair that damage. And so I think it's actually pretty practical stuff. It's not kind of philosophical. And so how did they do it? It was potluck dinners, Easter egg rolls on that common, for the kids, for that common grassy area, a little park between the churches. It was a shared youth group trip to Disney World that required some realization, for example, that a lot of the African American kids didn't sign up, and it was because of Trayvon Martin, right? And they were worried their kids wouldn't be safe in Florida. And the white parents never thought about that, right? So that meant they had to have that conversation. And it was, I think that's the kind of stuff, but it only happens, right, when there's, I think, a white church willing to kind of do its own work and then try to be in relationship with other churches of color and build those bridges, right? And it's uncomfortable, it's messy, hasn't been linear, been some setbacks, all that stuff. But I think they actually had a covenant service, though. I think that was one to commit themselves to working on this for a set number of years, which held everyone accountable. And I think that was actually pretty instrumental in it.
So, Rob, in your research, where do the Anabaptists, the peace churches, and people of other faith fall, whites who are from other faiths, where do they fall in your research?
Yeah, so we don't do typically in a national public opinion surveys, including this one, we typically don't break them out by denomination like that, but we do ask about Protestant or Catholic. So it's bigger categories. They would most likely end up in the evangelical category. We don't have enough of those groups in a national survey to actually break them out separately, unfortunately. They're in there, but we can't break them out. There's just not enough.
And here's an interesting question. Someone cited Book TV, which described how to start a civil war, and the question is, how do you stop a civil war?
Yeah, I think it's. We were actually just having this conversation as we're developing actually a new survey that's going to update some measures along these lines, and there has been more chatter about secession. There's a Supreme Court case right now, right, about elections and whether states have rights over federal, and whether even the legislature has rights over even state Supreme Courts, for example, and election decisions. And there's chatter about secession and those sorts of things. We are in the middle of, there's no doubt, huge divides. And one thing that's been striking, I think, is that the things that separate Americans have been less about policy and more about identity that we've seen in the last 10 years, this shift. It used to be that you could, pull an abortion or pull in same-sex marriage or, climate change or evolution, and you could kind of get policy things that would, healthcare actually as well. And more we're seeing the divides about identity. And one of the challenges is the two political parties, one of the challenges is that we only have two political parties, right? So there's this kind of binary effect in our politics. And that the parties have sorted themselves over the last generation much more so along racial and religious lines. So for example, today, the Republican Party is more than 2/3 white and Christian, right? The Democratic Party is about 1/3. white and Christian. A lot of Christians of color in the Democratic Party, but that shift is, I think, one of the things that we're really seeing, and those divides are getting bigger. Demographically speaking. Whites with a college degree, much more likely to be Democrat. Whites without college degree, much more likely to be Republican. So we're seeing education divides among whites and religious divides. White Christians, more likely to be Republican. White non-Christians, more likely to be Democrat, right? So, but if you think about that, there's not much more of a visceral way to divide. I've read some of the literature about countries that end up in civil war, and one of the markers is that political divisions are marked by religious divisions and racial divisions, right? So that the fights become less about policy and living to fight another day on another policy, and they almost become fights to the death, right? Because it's a winner-take-all, and it is a my identity versus your identity. Who are the real Americans? Who are the not-so-real Americans? Like those kinds of things. And those are really dangerous. It's a dangerous place for a democracy to be, right? Because that means that our political opponents are more and more cast as our enemies, right? And that's poison for a democracy.
Okay, I'm going to suggest we shift now and prepare for our other segment. Some of your questions didn't get asked, but I'm sure they'll get touched upon during the panel discussion. We'll have a panel following this presentation, so we're going to give the panel an opportunity to come forward and assemble and take a few minutes to do that, and give Rob a chance to sit down a bit. And then I'll also say to you, we thank you for your presence here and the support that you offer to the Pennsylvania Council of Churches. If you're inclined to give a free will offering to help defray the cost of this event, we invite you to put a check or some cash in an offering tray that is on the table outside in the narthex. So at any time during your leisure, we'd appreciate your support in that fashion. So let's make the shift now and take about a 7-minute break. Yes. Oh, yeah. Thank you. It's my pleasure now to begin this segment of our presentation as we hear from this panel that has been assembled. And let me take an opportunity to share with you our panelists. Dr. Greg Carey is professor of New Testament at Lancaster Theological Seminary and resident scholar at Holy Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church in Lancaster. The Reverend Dr. Gregory Edwards is the pastor of Resurrected Life Community Church, United Church of Christ, and president and CEO of the Resurrected Community Development Corporation under the leadership of the church and community development partners, and has been an important leader in the Lehigh Valley in providing education through the Freedom School at his church and development. Marilyn Mayo is the senior research fellow at AOL's Center on Extremism and has been, the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism, and she has been with the Anti-Defamation League for 25 years, previously serving as the co-director of ADL's Center on Extremism and the associate director of investigative research. Did I get everybody? Yeah. Okay. So our first speaker, and you know Rob, you heard from him. Our first speaker will be Marilyn Mayo.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to be here today, to be part of this conversation. And I want to thank Sandy and the organizers for inviting me here to speak. And I'm going to have something of a different tack that I'm going to be talking about, but something still very significant. And I wanted to just give you just a little bit of an idea about ADL. ADL is a Jewish civil rights organization. It's been around over 100 years. Our mission was based, initially was fighting anti-Semitism, which is something we still do, but our mission statement, even in 1913, was to fight for all people, and that's justice for all, basically. So I work for the Center on Extremism, and I wanted to just explain, where I'm coming from on all of this. We look at the whole spectrum of extremist ideology. So I focus on right-wing extremism, but we look at all kinds of extremism coming from every area. I will say that our goal at the Center on Extremism is not just to combat extremism, but to stop it. That is really what we're trying to do. The Center on Extremism has grown rapidly, given what the country's facing in the last, I would say, few years. We've grown from about 15 people to 40 people, which is just an indication of the work that's needed. And I am not a religion expert, I should say, at all. So I want to be very clear about that. And I'm probably the only person on the panel who doesn't have a background really in that. But I am an expert on the extremism that we're seeing, and one of the main issues right now that the trend that we're seeing that concerns us the most is the mainstreaming of extremism on many different levels. That's where I'm coming from in the presentation that I'm going to give right now. And this picture, Rob showed a picture from the January 6th, but this is a march that happened before January 6th that I will be talking about, called the Jericho March. That happened in December 2020 before January 6th, but I'll get to that. So basically, what I want to say is that there are, Rob was talking about Christian nationalism, and there are many different definitions of what Christian nationalism is, and I want to say that because my definition may be different than Rob's, although there are similarities. So I just picked out two, but I want to say that, we're seeing a lot of people write about Christian nationalism. This term has been basically introduced a lot in the last, I would say, 4 years or so. And different people mean different things. Some people mean the religious right. Some people mean the Christian right. Some people also mean it within the context of white supremacy and talking about white Christian churches. And so I think it's important to know that different people use the term differently. These two terms I just picked out because they're very recent, right? But they both get to some of the same idea, which is that about Christian nationalism being this idea that this is a Christian country, and that Christianity defines the country, and that it's the job of people like the government and others to keep it that way. And I think that is, even with the different definitions, and I think Rob also talked about that definition, but you have different people meaning different things. During the lunch hour, the apostolic movement came up, so I do have a slide on it because I think it's a really important piece of what we're seeing happening in the country. The apostolic movement has grown over the last few decades, and again, its adherents believe that the world needs to be. I don't want to read just from the slide, but this idea that there is that you need militant action, right, today on the earth to establish a godly government to Christ. And the way that this comes up is there's again, not an expert in religion, but the ideology is talking about these different forces, such as spiritual warfare and satanic forces that need to be defeated and things like that. And they also believe, and someone brought this up at lunch about the 7 mountains, and that's basically the arts, business, education, family, government, media, and religion. And that's to bring Christianity into those areas of civic life. And I think part of what we're seeing going on in terms of Christian nationalism is that this movement has grown and is gaining ground, and that some of these ideas that we're hearing people talk about come somewhat from that. Again, this was touched on as well about the fear of political, social, and cultural changes. We know that some Christian nationalists want to recreate a Christian nation with a focus on traditional families, traditional roles. There has been, and we haven't talked about this as much today, but there is literally a war going on against the LGBTQ community, particularly the transgender community, where people are being really attacked in a variety of ways. And we know that hospitals are that treat transgender children are being targeted. We know that schools are being targeted, that, and the LGBTQ community is, anyone who's in that community is called a groomer. So there's a lot going on there, and again, it has to do with this fear of all these changes that have happened in society. We also see that the left and liberalism, progressivism is being defined as evil, or as an evil force to be defeated. I mentioned the Jericho March, and I want to bring that up because it's going to bring me to the piece that I want to talk about, which is the extremism. So the Jericho March took place in D.C. in December 2020, and at that march, you had people who were fired up about the election, believed that election fraud had taken place. They were Trump supporters, and they had these rallies called Stop the Steal, right, thinking that the election was stolen. And they likened the Stop the Steal events to the biblical soldiers and priests breaching the walls of Jericho in the Battle of Jericho. So it had a lot of religious fervor, but also at this prayer march, at the Jericho March, you had white supremacists, you had conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones, some of you may be familiar with him, who said that the shooting of all those children, that horrendous shooting in Sandy Hook was a hoax, and he's on trial right now for that, parents took him to court. And it also included like anti-government groups, including Stuart Rhodes from the Oath Keepers, who is now on trial for sedition. So I'm trying to give you a sense of all the people who were part of this religious rally that actually brought in all these extremist elements. This is just to, again, I'm not going to talk a lot about January 6th. Like it was something that we had been watching. Those of us who monitor extremism, we knew that violence was going to take place that day. And it was a very alarming event to see happen in our country, where people were trying to overthrow a duly elected person, believing that that wasn't the case. But the reason I bring up January 6th is because I want to talk about post-January 6th and what we're seeing now. There are a series of conferences taking place across the country that are directed at pastors and churches by, it's a group, the man who's in charge, his name is Clay Clark, and he does these conferences called Reawaken America. And they're held in churches around the country, and again, they bring in pastors, but along with the pastors, they bring in conspiracy theorists, and the conspiracy theorists on election fraud, COVID, and also all sorts of other conspiracies. And the latest, and you can see this is one that's happening in Pennsylvania in October 21st and 22nd, so it's coming up. And in Mannheim, I believe it is.
Lancaster County.
Yeah. And so in that, what is the theme of this latest, like Clay Clark has done these since the insurrection, but the latest theme is called the Great Reset. So what is the Great Reset? The Great Reset is a warning that the global elites are using the pandemic to advance their interests. And I lost the signal as I was reading. Okay, it's still up there, but it's not on my monitor. Okay, well, I'm going to go like this. I hope you'll all bear with me. But it's basically this idea that that globalists are trying to destroy America's sovereignty. And it has an anti-Semitic element to it as well, right? By saying that that part of the conspiracy is that, this is a little hard, isn't it? That the goal is to create a globalist traditionalist regime. And this is something that comes up, at these conferences. And it also brings together, in addition to the people I've mentioned, many political figures go to these conferences, and so especially candidates. And I'm not going to talk about any particular candidate because we're a 501c3 organization and I can't. But if you look up this conference, you'll see that someone that is probably known to a lot of you is going to be speaking at the next one. So I want to just point out, and I think, is there any way to get the monitor back on? Or, I don't know. I wanted to bring up another aspect of, Christian nationalism. This just came out this week. Ali Alexander, there we go. Thank you so much. Thank you. Makes my life a little easier. Ali Alexander was someone who organized the Stop the Steal rallies. And even though Ali Alexander is not white, he works with white supremacists. He's someone who has affiliated himself with a number of white supremacists. But this is something that he just said on his podcast on this Monday. He was saying that we will not live in a future where violence doesn't meet widespread perversion. He's talking here again about the LGBTQ community. He's saying, I am aligned with God, that will not march quietly into the future where you got all kinds of things happening at public eateries, and he's talking about, that he's going to be joined by tens of millions of people, and he's going to teach people what the moral line is, and then he says, and if they don't deal with the middle, then they should meet a violent Christian crusade. So I'm just trying to give you a sense of the language that we're seeing from different aspects of the kind of extremist world that's out there beyond white supremacy, although I am going to get to white supremacy now. Again, a number of white supremacists that we look at are calling themselves Christian nationalists now. They didn't before, okay, some of them, but it is a way to exploit something that is being talked about a lot, right? We're hearing this term Christian nationalism a lot. So this is Nick Fuentes. He is a white supremacist who was at the Unite the Right rally in 2017 in Charlottesville. And he's someone who presents himself as a Christian conservative. And in fact, he has a conference, he's had it for 2 years in a row, the America First Political Action Conference. It's held at the same time as CPAC, which is the Conservative Political Action Conference. And he actually has politicians who come to that conference who are elected officials who go and speak there, even though it's a white supremacist event. And they say, but he's a Christian conservative. No, he's a white supremacist, but he uses Christianity to promote his ideology. And so, for example, when he and the Groypers are the people who support him, they call themselves Groypers. There's more to that, but I don't want to take up a lot of time. But in any case, when they march against, they've marched against abortion clinics, they'll shout, "Christ is King." They hold up crosses, as you can see in this picture. So and there have been many other groups that have exploited Christianity in terms of an extremist way. There's the Christian identity movement, which is different than what Rob was talking about. It's Christian identity is like what Aryan Nations, the neo-Nazi group, they were a Christian identity group, and they believe that whites are the chosen people and that all non-whites are mud people and don't deserve to have any kind of equal representation in the world. I want to just mention another person who's talking a lot about Christian nationalism is Andrew Torber from Gab. Gab is a social media site. It's a social media site that a lot of people who were thrown off of Twitter went to, but it's an extremist. I want to make very clear that a lot of extremists are on that site. And Torba, again, didn't call himself a Christian nationalist just a few years ago, but he does now, and he says he wants to build a coalition of Christian nationalists, and we're going to take this country back for the glory of God. And again, we don't want people who are atheists. We don't want people who are Jewish. We don't want people who are non-believers, agnostic. This isn't a Christian movement, and it's in this explicitly Christian country. And he is someone who very explicitly anti-Semitic, very much talks about the power Jews have over the country and makes a lot of anti-Semitic tropes, but and attracts a lot of followers on Gab. The last thing I want to say is just that clearly I was asked to talk about anti-Semitism, and I want to just say that this whole idea of a Christian nation or Christian nationalism, of course it affects the Jewish community, but not just the Jewish community. It affects the Muslim community, any community that's not Christian that feels that they are being made the other and to not feel welcome or belong in this country. And unfortunately, it can lead to anti-Semitism and other bigotry when people start saying, well, this is being promoted like, that we should be a Christian country. Maybe these other people should leave, And so I think, and again, Rob touched on this, that it is so important to have events like this and for all communities of faith to work together to try to address what's going on, because we are seeing so much extremism in many different ways. I've just touched on it. But this mainstreaming, this idea that people can pretty much not just say many bigoted things, but they're really losing faith in democracy and democratic institutions. And I think that that's something that we should all be concerned about. I'm going to stop there, but thank you so much.
I am our non-expert. I'm a biblical scholar, not a sociologist or historian. I'm here to offer sort of a Christian theological response to Christian nationalism. And I'd like to call attention, Pastor Edwards and I are both deeply involved in Power Interfaith, which is a grassroots organizing campaign in Pennsylvania that is conducting, if you have this flyer, a Freedom Express bus tour that will arrive in Harrisburg on Friday the 4th, in Lancaster on Thursday the 3rd. I don't have all the other dates, but I hope you received the flyer. So when I go into churches to talk about, and bars most recently, to talk about what white Christian nationalism looks like, I use this picture. It's the picture of Donald Trump holding a Bible in front of St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington. And why do I use that? Well, let's recall the moment. This is 2020. The police murder of George Floyd has happened. Black Lives Matter protests are happening around the country. They are intense. And then President Donald Trump made a speech, had law enforcement clear a path using tear gas and force, and walked to St. John's Episcopal Church where he held up a Bible. What did it mean? He didn't say anything at the church. He held up a Bible in front of a church for a photo op. What I would argue is white Christian nationalism is an attempt on the part of some white Christians to enforce their understanding of Christian values on the rest of society. And in that way, that means that Christian symbols and Christian language become props for white power. So what do I mean by props? Well, Donald Trump is holding up a Bible. It wasn't his Bible. He didn't have a Bible in the White House. They literally, according to news reports, brought in a stack of Bibles for him to choose the one that looked and felt best for holding up. What about the church? Well, the bishop of the Diocese of Washington, D.C. said, wish he hadn't come. He sure didn't ask permission. Right? So the Bible is not because Donald Trump loves the Bible. He says he loves all of it, but, wouldn't name a favorite passage. And as I like to say, I too have Southern Baptist roots. Never saw a Southern Baptist hold a Bible like that. But let's also reset the moment. There's the use of Christian symbols, and there's the context of racial conflict, right? Donald Trump, through this period, has been intensely critical of the Black Lives Matter protest. We've learned since that he asked the Pentagon, can we shoot them in the legs to break up the protest? So he's asserting himself as a defender of law and order against what he's describing as violent protest, and he's going to inject law and order, white authority, under the banner of the Bible, the church, and all of that in that moment. That is what white Christian nationalism looks like. And the reason I call attention, this is a picture of your book, Robbie, with a quote. The reason I call attention to this dimension is because the folks who are doing white Christian nationalism want to exercise dominion, they say, in the name of Christ. But if you compare their social stances to the social stances, for example, of black Christians, they couldn't be farther apart on a national spectrum. If you compare them to social justice proclamations of the Roman Catholic Church, the United Methodist Church, the United Church of Christ, American Baptists, and on, you would find that they don't speak for the broader white church either, right? But they use the language of Christianity to claim that cultural privilege. We saw it during COVID. I wish, as a scholar, I feel bad I didn't document this slide when I saw this meme on Twitter. The church in 2020, right, while we're wearing masks, sheep with masks, that's bad. What the church should look like, lions on the prowl. Oh, I don't know. I study the book of Revelation more than any other book in the Bible. And there's a moment in Revelation where Jesus is about to be introduced, and you hear he's going to be introduced as the Lion of Judah, when in fact what John sees is a wounded lamb. And throughout the book of Revelation, Jesus is a lamb. This is a theme in the New Testament. It's a theme in all of the Christian scriptures, and so I'm including Jewish scriptures, that God works through the least and the not much count, right? And so the idea that what Christians should be acting like in society is like lions is, well, antithetical to what I tend to think of as Christianity. And so just a few points to think about what I'm trying to say about white Christian nationalism. Throughout the movement, we hear the language. This goes back beyond the New Apostolic Reformation and the Seven Mountains of Culture to R.J. Rushdoony, who wrote a book called The Institutes of Biblical Law that is big in some circles of Christianity. Christians should take dominion, they say, over society. And as we see in an image like this and in that idea of dominion, one criticism I would offer is they misconstrue what freedom means in Christian discourse. They have a version of freedom that is, I can do whatever I want, regardless of how it affects anyone else. When we encounter the idea of freedom in Judaism and Christianity, it is freedom from bondage in order to build community and practice love. If I had more time, I could give you 30 minutes on that. So they misconstrue freedom. They use Jesus as a symbol and a brand name. I recently saw the phrase as a hood ornament. But if you listen to their preaching, they almost never mention Jesus' teachings or his practices of feeding and healing everybody, or spending time with sinners and not criticizing them, of building community as he goes. They ignore the activities of Jesus to make Jesus a brand name. They use the cross as a symbol. They'll put it with a flag or with a rifle. But they never talk about the cross as an example of God working through weakness to bring life and renewal for the world. Nationalism of any kind is an idolatry. So we get language within the New Testament of many will come from the north and south and east and west to dine with Abraham and his descendants at the table. We get the language of every tribe and tongue and language and people being gathered in the book of Revelation. The idea that one nation is specially favored by God without being obligated. Let's think about the election of Abraham. All the nations of the earth are to be finding blessing through Abraham. That's Genesis. And one more thing that will sound counterproductive to you. A little bit of high theology, but Christian nationalists have a weak understanding of sin. What I mean by that is they love to talk about sin. They love to talk about trans kids and LGBT people and what people do with their clothes off. That kind of sin. But it hasn't crossed their minds that, as Lutherans would say, I'm not Lutheran, Lutherans would say we are captive to sin and cannot free ourselves. All of us. There is no guarantee that if Christians ran the world, things would be just or equitable or healthy. In fact, we got 2,000 years of proof. We've run the experiment a few times. We've got hundreds of years of Christians running away from other Christians. Right. It was the Confederacy that decided to put God in their Constitution. And so I offer these thoughts about dominion as a misconstrual of freedom, about Jesus and the cross as symbols rather than taking seriously their content, of idolatry, and of a sort of hubris that denies the reality of sin for all human beings as things those of us who are spokespeople for our faith, and particularly in a Christian context, have the capacity to name, be articulate about, and be, I hope, to folks who are persuadable, compelling. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I told Dr. Pickens it was a dangerous thing to put me up to preach or speak for 10 minutes. And I know we've all eaten lunch. So let me say this. As someone in black-skinned identity, I've been black all my life. Like most of you have been white or black or brown all your life. The question really becomes, after you gather more intel, after you listen to the scholars, after you read the books, White Too Long, and become an expert in racism and white supremacy and the nomenclature of where America is, what will you do? I have found that it's far easier to attend a conference, go to a Bible study, or join a book club than it is to interrupt racism and white supremacy at the church picnic when the treasurer is counting the Sunday morning offering, or when that relative sits at the Thanksgiving dinner table and you minimize and diminish their comments by, well, that's just the way he's always been. This work is not just a work of an academic endeavor, one of the head. It is the work of the heart. What has happened through racism and white supremacy is a separation of the head work and the heart work that must be done in the moment we are in these yet-to-be United States. We've got enough research, Robbie. We've preached the sermons. We've been at the marches. Most of us would consider ourselves, and here dare I say, the other white meat. We're not like them. The reality is that folk of good faith and moral courage, in the moment we are in, specifically in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I'm reminded that not too far from here, the largest and the bloodiest battle in the nation took place. What will happen when we just continue to come to the right events to say we're not with those folk, and we separate ourselves and we have been able to intellectualize? I want us, perhaps in the remaining moments that we have left, to really engage in some serious discourse that, if we do it the right way, won't lead you to shame, but lead you to discomfort. I have found that America has an idolatry of being comfortable. You know, it's been said that church is not a place to necessarily comfort or disturb the comfortable, but comfort the disturbed. And the reality is, there is this idolatry, first of all, of control and comfort and a fear of contradiction. America is a place of contradiction, freedom, and slavery. The church, as Robbie said, the church, through his research, the more white folk go to church, the more racist they become. I believe that's what you said. Now, that's not saying that there's not good folk in church. Hear me. There's people that we love that are in our families and in our pews and in our schools, whom we love, but who are also racist. That's the contradiction. And so I sometimes don't want to just simply use the word racist and white supremacist, because as soon as somebody hears those words, they think, well, they're bad. The reality is that there are many folk who have engaged in racist, prejudicial, and practices that emerge from white supremacists who've done some pretty decent things. That's the contradiction. That's the contradiction that we have to deal with, and we are in this moment where we have to have some radical truth-telling. I come from a tradition that says you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free, but we don't like the truth. The truth is kind of oftentimes in America stranger than fiction. So we will continue to be enamored and romance this deeply mythologized notion of the founding fathers being men of faith who, yes, also engaged in chattel slavery. Contradiction. The church is a place of contradiction as well. America is a walking contradiction, right? So unless we are really able to understand one thing, I'm going to take my seat. Racism and white supremacy has impacted all of us. It's in the air we breathe. It's in the water we drink. It's just going to kill some of us quicker than others of us. You can't zip code your way out of it. You can't educate your way out of it. It's impacted every institution in this nation. We have exported it into the world. It is our number one brand of export, racism and white supremacy. And the church has not been inoculated from it. Even the most liberal, the most progressives, where we believe God is still speaking. So we've got to admit that, and it's going to kill all of us. If left uninterrupted and not dismantled, it will kill all of us, just at slower rates. We are, as Dr. King said, we are all connected intrinsically with a mutual fabric that binds us together in the human story. And at this moment, so I'm both the C3 and the C4, Power Action Fund. There are some folk who are running for public office who have weaponized faith and who want to enshroud their political ideology with public policy that will kill my children. No fault of their own. And I need good folk who are Muslims and Jewish, Christian folk, to get off the fence. To get off the fence and to join others in the sea of justice so that we can really begin to shift the narrative in America. We are literally in a do or die moment. And Pennsylvania really is ground zero for stemming the tide that might just be seeking to ruin the republic. And so as we leave this place and we have discourse, I hope something challenges you. I hope something makes you uncomfortable enough to examine your own way of being. White Christian nationalism, it's not just a matter of stopping something. It's deeply embedded in our way of being. It's ontological. It's like divorcing yourself from yourself. And as churches and households and places of worship are spiritual, but they're also about cultural identity and the sociology of our race and culture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. To which Dr. King said that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated day of the week, and it still is. And so I want to challenge us as we go forward, led by Dr. Pickens in this conversation, to really do some head check, and heart check. I have found that many folk like the head check because the head check is safe. The head check's about the definitions, the book work. But this work is not just about head, it's also about heart. And you really need both to engage in it. So I welcome the dialogue. I'm grateful that you all are here, and I'm also thankful that I was invited to be a part of this esteemed panel. Blessings to you.
All right, the table has been set. And I just want to start out with the panel to first say thank you all for sharing from your experience and helping us see this question from various perspectives. What is evident in the room is that we have people who serve congregations, pastors, Christian educators, and the question they're asking is one in some ways that speaks to the reality. how do we as leaders in a congregation raise issues around Christian nationalism and keep our people?
Sorry.
I think that kind of gets where some folk are thinking, and I want to hear what your thoughts are about that in terms of what's the pedagogy, what's the critical way that we can help pastors address these issues.
Go ahead, Dr. Carey.
I don't know how possible it is. I heard my brother laugh at the question. I talk to a lot of pastors. I visit more churches than the Holy Spirit. And it's always been a challenge, but what happens now is as soon as you address any issue, it's a litmus test of your loyalty to one side or the other. So the only suggestion I would have is, you know, in Robbie's book, he talks about our tendency to go to doctrine and divorce it from relationships and society. There's a way to go to doctrine and connect it to society. So, for example, I talked about freedom. What do we understand by freedom? What do our scriptures have to say about insider-outsider dynamics? It's not always good news, but there's a lot of good news. To talk about what does it mean to love our neighbor in concrete ways. So, you know, I think that's the best we can do, but I'll just note there's a lot of reporting lately on how many white evangelical pastors are resigning because it's impossible in their churches.
Just had a couple things. I suspect that, like, buried in that question is, how do I keep my job? You know, because that's been the history has been, you know, if we look back to the 60s and 70s in many white Christian churches, one or two things happened. White pastors spoke up, or they didn't. The ones who spoke up, vast majority of them lost their jobs, right? The churches dispensed with them. There's a great book called Born of Conviction, and talks about Methodist ministers down in the South who like a couple of them resigned en masse, right, as a result of a church not being willing to admit an African-American person to membership. So I think the challenge has been, and then the other challenge has been, we've had a whole generation of enabler ministers who chose to stay, right, but not push. And so here we are, one more generation, right, with these things. Right, you know, I remember I read about this in the book. Just one quick example. You know, the only two black people I remember in my white Southern Baptist church in Southwest Jackson was a friend of ours that we invited to a church lock-in, which meant that Sunday morning we sang in the choir, right? But that meant that there was one black face in the choir facing the congregation, this all-white congregation. It precipitated an emergency deacons meeting. This is in 1985, right? To decide what to do if our friend wanted to join the church, because we had a closed policy of, it was a kind of not talked about, but it was on the books. We do not admit black members in our Baptist church. And so it was an emergency deacons meeting, because here he is, he's in the choir, he's with the youth group. Maybe they're going to join the church. Like, what is this? Is like freak out moment. You know, there, and the only other person, the only other African American person I ever remember in the sanctuary was a person from Parchman Farm that had been brought in as a singer, a gospel singer. He was brought in his prison garb with an armed white guard sitting in the back row of and whose testimony reinforced every black stereotype any of us would have had. He's from Detroit, got in trouble in Detroit, drugs, grand theft auto, came down to Mississippi, got in some more trouble, imprisoned, but now he's found, through a white chaplain, found the Lord, right, in Parchman Farm. And now he's out singing at white churches, right, not black churches. And that's it. So I think we just haven't, it's nuts, right? That we are still struggling with this. But I think it's because either people spoke up and they lost their jobs, or they knew that was going to happen and they didn't, and here we are.
I think of different folk who were leading various faith traditions in the 60s who came back to their parishes, and they were moved out of the parsonage. Some marriages ended as a result of folks who became freedom riders or who walked across the Selma Pettis Bridge, right? So the notion of basically how do I become a prophetic witness and also make people comfortable it's a contradiction. Now, I understand that when I answer this question, I speak from black-skinned identity, and I pastor people who primarily look like me. I get that. But in this moment that we're in, we need we need colleagues who are willing to put what they have said is justice before their jobs. Because if you don't, you're basically sacrificing my children and my grandchildren because of the racial animosity and the racial toxicity in the nation. One of my mentors, Reverend Jeremiah Wright, said, sometimes the church grows not by who comes, but by who leaves. And what a horrible thing it is to be held hostage, in a church and not able to preach and proclaim truth as you know it, based upon how you see. What the torment of that. I mean, just the emotional, psychological torment of having to climb into a pulpit, and you know that if you preach a certain way, or you engage the congregation a certain way, I know I've got colleagues who were like, in the midst of the George Floyd situation, like, Greg, what am I going to do? Because I'm about to lose my job on Sunday. And in one particular case, I said, I'll go with you. We'll go with you. And remember this. That church you're pastoring didn't call you in the ministry. They may have called you on paper. But God and the universe called you. Don't get it twisted now. Don't get it. If God called you, right? And so that's a challenge because I think it's one of economics, right? You can't do this work, though, without some level of sacrifice. I mean, I just think and sometimes it will be a sacrifice of one's way of living and one's way of being. So for those that stand up, thank you and kudos.
Marilyn, I'm interested in hearing from you as you work on issues of extremism. Have there been many opportunities to partner with Christian communities, Muslim communities around those issues, and how has that developed?
The ADL partners with lots of different community organizations and religious organizations, and this is something we've done for years and years. And we have 26 regional offices across the country, and so it's usually on a local level that I work for the national office, so I'm in New York, but we have offices everywhere, and it's usually within the community that the regional ADL office, that they will build relationships with Christian and Muslim groups, and also right now, for example, I know a lot of us are really concerned about the elections, for example, and this is just like a different aspect of it, but we are working with lots of different community groups on that issue because we're worried about poll intimidation and things like that. So that's one thing, that's because the midterms are coming up so soon. But I think it's incredibly important to create those partnerships. In listening to everybody talk, I realize that I'm not a pastor, obviously, but I think that it's building, again, like all the things that we're talking about here today, it is about building community and not just building, and I think people have made this point, taking action and seeing what we can do, working together. So I think, again, like just it's creating connections, and that's what's happening today, like, you know, to take that into the community. You know, we have an office in Philly, for example, so.
Thank you. Let me ask this question. As we think of a path toward racial healing, what role do you see the Christian community or other faith communities playing in bringing about racial healing in our country?
We need a reclamation of American history that includes the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? There's a principle in Africa called Sankofa. The Sankofa bird, the head looks one way, the feet look the other way. It's this notion that oftentimes when you are in the midst of trauma, struggle, or are looking for healing, sometimes the only way out of a thing is to go back through it. Part of what makes healing difficult is that you oftentimes have to open up wounds. And anybody who's in the medical profession or has done any kind of wound care, I've got nurses and folks who are in the congregation that I pastor who have told me that if you are treating a wound, oftentimes when a wound is healing, there'll be a false healing or a false piece of skin that will actually look like it's being healed, that you have to cut away in order for genuine healing to take place in the body, right? And I think our nation has survived by this false veneer, superficial sense of healing. As Robbie said, we try to go to the mountaintop of reconciliation, but we don't want to go to the valley of reparation. There's got to be a reclaiming of history. There's got to be a retelling of stories. I think storytelling is a pathway to healing. When we share stories, we find points of connection and departure around what it means to be human. And then I think there's got to be some renewal in mind and practice, which also embodies public policy, right? That my renewal of mind and my thinking and changing my way of being as a result of going back through and learning that I had a grandfather perhaps who owned persons and was a deacon in the church, right? That's an ugly history. But that's a history that we have to be reconciled to, right? In order for us to find a pathway to healing. I think that for me that's, you know, we're all entitled to our opinions, but the reality is we all don't start with the same set of facts in this nation. You know, and I think until we kind of get there through a reclamation of history about how this nation was founded, I think we'll still go in divergent paths and we'll never kind of, well, wait a minute, there's some good here in America, but we also have a very sordid, ugly, tragic, horrific history, and yet my people come out of that, and yet we're resilient. So in the midst of the horror of the transatlantic slave trade, I am here as a result of somebody who endured the horror to get through hope, right? That's a history that my children need to know, right? So I think there's something to be said for the reclamation of history, retelling of our stories, and the renewal of our practices.
I'm going to add a little bit here from a Jewish perspective, because something that's happened in the last few years in terms of at ADL and within the larger Jewish community is that Jews of color have felt very left out of the Jewish community, and in fact felt like they were not heard, recognized, seen in any way. And I think there's been and ADL has been part of this to some degree, an effort to reach out to Jews of color to actually bring more Jews of color into positions within the Jewish community. And I think we have that long struggle too, to actually, take action in that area. And I think it's really just starting, but I want to just say that it is a piece of what's happening in the Jewish community as well, just to add that perspective.
One of the things that shines through in Robbie's work is relationships of accountability, which is different than friendships, but relationships in which you're accountable. We try to build that in Power Interfaith, where religious leaders of color redirect those of us who are white. And we have to learn that, when it comes to these issues, they have insights we don't, and maybe we need to be redirected. Most of you who are clergy have said things from pulpits you would not have said, if you could reflect on it, if a rabbi was in the front row. So do you get together with rabbis in your community to talk about the work that you're all doing? Do you find as pastors those kinds, again, it's not just a friendship, it's not just friendliness, but relationships where someone will look you in the eyes and tell you the truth and you become accountable to it. I think that is an essential part of repair. And I thank Robbie for the way he describes it in his book.
Here's a question I want to share that came from the audience, kind of refers to you, Dr. Edwards. It says you use the phrase interrupters of racism and white supremacy. The term interrupters is also used by Christian nationalists in their manuals for spreading their movement. Also, they deem anyone who questions their actions or calls out their lies is spreading negativity, opposite of Dr. Edwards' radical truth-telling. Question, coincidence? Is their choice of terminology intentional?
Yeah, obviously. Their choice of terminology, I don't want to, we're not all monolithic, but certainly from my Christian perspective and my faith, Jesus was an interrupter, right? But the interruption wasn't for the purpose of castigating and segregating, but really for uniting, not over error, but over the possibility of creating community, right? Bringing people closer. So I think part of what's happened, specifically I'll also say, at least in my experience with progressive political entities and organizations and institutes, is that the language of faith has been so hijacked by the right that we are afraid to lean into our faith because we don't want to offend. So we have, to a large extent, progressives have conceded our faith to the extremist because we don't want to be seen as, oh, here they come, they're a Bible thumper, here they come, so because that's the popular narrative. That's the narrative that's oftentimes at the table, even amongst progressives. And I think from my perspective, at least from my lineage and my embodiment in terms of my ministry, that as I look at Fannie Lou Hamer and Rosa Parks and Malcolm X and Dr. King, all of them were people of deep moral conviction. Deep moral conviction. And it was that deep moral conviction that caused them to either sit, stand, interrupt, insert, dismantle, reject. And so I think that we ought not concede. We ought not concede the language of our faith for fear of what this group has done to it. We've got to show up differently, but we've got to be careful with the words that we use, because the words that we use have been weaponized in order to create great harm in our nation. So, yeah, good question.
One of the questions that has arisen is, well, let me ask it this way. There has been some research around how did our nation incorporate Vietnam veterans who came back from Vietnam, and the role that many of them play in much of the movements that are taking place around militarism, and in some ways being connected to Christian nationalism. Has there been much discussion or research around the levels of militarism that is seemingly becoming a part of the Christian nationalist movement, and how is that being tracked?
I got nothing. But that never stops me. You know, the folks who would have come back from Vietnam are in their 70s now.
Yeah.
And I ran into an 18-year-old who was proud to tell me he was an white kid installing a Dixie horn in his truck. Tried to talk him out of it. There's a lot of resentment in our culture. The polling data shows that white evangelicals poll it as saying that they are the most persecuted group in the United States. Mm-hmm. Now, I will say, as someone who comes from kind of nowhere, Alabama, that I carry some of that resentment. I remember when the factory shut down and my best friend's dad tried to take his life. As a scholar, it's pretty common for me to be the only Alabamian in the room at a national meeting and to hear things about where I'm from. And so there is a certain resentment. It's easy to convince a lot of white people that there are these elites out there out to oppress them. It's misplaced, I think, but if we're not at least honest that they're carrying it, and that some of us who are white in the room carry some of it and try to deal with it in healthy ways, I don't know that we'll be able to build the kinds of relationships that will affect change.
I'll add a little bit to that. In terms of what I was talking about in general with extremism and playing out within Christian nationalism, we do look at various movements in the country that are putting this idea of like being a Christian patriot, and they call themselves that. They call themselves Christian patriots. That if you don't believe what they believe, which is basically that we need to have a white majority country still, and that and again, there is a lot of grievance, and there's a sense of grievance and persecution from these folks. But that if you don't believe that there is a war, and we're hearing words like civil war going on, mm-hmm. that you are not fighting, that they are the real patriots, and they're the ones who are going to basically save the country and save America. And this is something we're seeing over and over again from various different kinds of extremist groups, America First groups, from some militia groups, from the far right, which includes a lot of different kinds of extremists like the election, the people who are believing in all these conspiracies. QAnon, that QAnon, and QAnon is basically a group that feels that there's a group of pedophiles that Democrats and Hollywood stars are these pedophiles who are actually kidnapping children and drinking their blood. I mean, this is like an actual belief. of QAnon folks. But QAnon people believe that it's almost like again, I'm not an expert on Christianity, but they have this belief that, of Donald Trump as the savior who's actually going to come and save this country from this evil. And I bring that up because we're seeing that kind of, be filtered out into other areas, and it's very concerning because these are the same folks who are willing to forego, democratic institutions because they, because of their sense of grievance, because they think that they need a savior because the country is controlled by evil forces. So there's a lot in that, but I'm going to stop there.
This is a question about reparations. And are there any good examples of communities or settings where the work of reparations is taking place that you are aware of that we could share today?
Yeah, you can give a couple. Yes, I mean, there's some serious efforts, particularly in the Episcopal Church, going on. Episcopal institutions and dioceses, New York, Maryland, Texas, where they're actually setting up like multi-million-dollar funds. The one tricky thing here for me is that is that many of the reparation funds, and I celebrate all of the efforts, like I am, let's let 1,000 flowers bloom, and let's let people be creative and think about how this works. Evanston, Illinois, where my wife is from, has set up, the city government has set up a fund for anyone that can show they were discriminated against in housing, is now eligible for rent assistance, mortgage assistance, down payment assistance in the city of Evanston, just on the north side of Chicago. So there's all those efforts. The one challenge for me is that I have yet to see major efforts that don't include, or that don't start from, we're going to keep what we've got. Almost all of them are, we're going to raise new money. Right? But we're going to keep what we got, thank you very much, right? So all the big endowments, all the investments, like all the buildings, we're going to hang on to all those, but we'll raise some more money. I think it's appropriate for those things to move forward, but I think where the thing hasn't quite happened is for people to think, oh, well, Trinity Wall Street owns like a huge section of Manhattan, right? What does it mean for that church to own that much of that kind of real estate? And what would happen if those apartment buildings and business built and corporate space that they own were liquidated, right? And the church put the money towards something that might look like reparations. Like that would be a lot more than the $2-3 million efforts that are going on. So I don't want to be overly critical, because I think any effort toward that I think is appropriate and is, I think, in the right spirit. But I'd like to see some serious questions about denominations and entities that have huge endowments, right, built on the backs of free labor from enslaved people. Take that into account.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so it's the American Medical Association says that when a people have gone through genocide, it takes 25 generations for that genocide to be expelled out of their DNA, right? So the way that I parent my children, the way that I show up as a spouse, a lot of that has to do with the vestiges of slavery that I'm not even aware of, that show up in how I show up in public spaces and in my families. So that's about 625 years. 25 generations is about 625 years for the vestiges of that, for that DNA to be actually out of, exposed from. And so we are, at least folk in black-skinned identity, who are the descendants of those who've been enslaved, are far away from ever really fully being free. Reparations have to be financial, retroactive, and they can't just be financial, they also have to deal with the emotional trauma, right, that has been so evident within the African American community, and it should be systemic, right? So, and ultimately, when you talk about reparations, as been alluded, folk want to give or raise money, but don't want to give up what they got. And that's the challenge, right? When you have those conversations. Well, I didn't own any slaves. You know, we were poor folk. We were indentured servants. And but the reality is the nation has built its wealth from certain practices that still are concretized in public policy and that we all are benefiting from, by the way. So that's a conversation. You know, I'm going to go out on a skinny limb. I know we're on cable television. You know, I was talking to somebody about this, and I said, you know, how about this? If you can prove that you were related to somebody, you are the descendant of somebody who was enslaved, you don't have to pay any more taxes to this nation. You've already paid your taxes, income and otherwise. You know, and how do we systematize that? Really, let's talk about it, right? But then other groups get mad, right? So many of us feel we have already paid our way through the society, even though many of us still act like we are renting a house that we actually built and should own the mortgage too. So, I mean, it's a conversation that we have to continue to place in rooms like this.
Let me follow up on that, Reverend Edwards. It could be suggested that racism is a form of national trauma that we have experienced as a country. And that trauma has affected black and white people and red people and other groups. And my question is, what's the, well, we know the situation, but what's the cure? What has to happen in our national fabric to address that trauma that you've already described that impacts not only black people, but this whole nation?
I'm going to give that to the folk at the other end of the table.
I'm going to say just a couple of things. I don't think there's a silver bullet
Yeah.
answer here. I do think stuff on the ground locally.
Yes.
So, right, this is not a top-down thing. I think there's things that can be done with policy, but I think in terms of like repair, healing, that kind of thing, that's going to happen at the local level. And I just think those two churches in Macon I talked about are pretty good examples of, I think many of the white people on the white side of that equation would say, like, coming to terms with that history and being in relationship with people, right, that they've ignored for so long and been on the wrong side of, right? We're on the side of segregation, right, just 2 generations ago, you know, or 1 generation ago, depending on your age. You know, my parents in Macon attended, there were segregated movie theaters, that's my parents, right? That's not that far back. So I think that's a piece of it. The only other thing I want to make sure I say here is, because I feel like one thing I left off in an earlier answer is, I'm going to borrow something that our Lutheran friends like to talk about, and that is grace, which is difficult, right, to hang on to, because I think we're, and as pastors here, but I think somewhere between the prophetic and the pastoral, we've got to find that ground, because I want to, like, remember, like, so I had a Confederate flag on my truck in high school, right? That's me. Right? I played in the band. We played Dixie every time our football team, who were the Forest Hill Rebels, scored a touchdown in high school. Right? In college, at my Baptist college, we were the Choctaws. And we would chant from the stands while doing the little tomahawk thing, scalp 'em, Choctaws, scalp 'em, at my Baptist college. Right? So that's my history. My grandfather, in 1963, was a deacon at East Macon Baptist Church and was charged with standing on the steps and preventing any non-white people from entering the sanctuary. Right? That's me, right? And it has been a long, hard, embarrassing, uncomfortable journey that I am still on. I've got a PhD in religion and a seminary degree, right? And I have found, you know, this re-education of myself to be really hard. and uncertain and vertigo-inducing. Like, it's hard. And so I think, like, making room for people to stumble, right? Making room for people to kind of freak out maybe every now and then as they are trying to confront, this stuff, but not letting them off the hook, right? There's this great example, I'll close with this, of this poignant moment in those two churches in Macon where they had gone to Montgomery to EJI's museum, that's this memorial to lynching victims, right? And many of you may have gone. And they were on their way back, and they were having a debriefing section, and one of the women, the white women in the room, like, broke down in tears, and she's just like, I just don't know what to do. I'm just so uncomfortable. I'm just beside myself. And this African-American woman walked up to her, put her arms around her, and just simply said, of course you are. And just left it, right? Didn't say it's okay, didn't try to, like, it just left it in the room. And I feel like we had to live in that space, but I think the sheer ignorance, like, and one of the things that promotes my work, I think, is got me, I'm so angry that I was lied to.
Yeah.
I'm so mad that I was lied to. I was at church 5 days a week growing up, right? If there was anything about this stuff, I would have heard it. But I'm just so mad at my Sunday school teachers, my pastors, like, who didn't tell me the truth about all this, right? And so I think that's just kind of part of it. So how can we give that gift to our kids, to the next generation who won't have to feel lied to, right, about how we got to where we are? And how do we make space while not letting people off the hook, right, for this really difficult and non-linear journey?
Yeah. Can I just say something, because I'm chomping at the bit, and you alluded to it. But to me, the sort of elephant in the room for me, if we would insist on taking the golden rule seriously, it starts with what we teach to our kids, and what we, that's what we have to be. We have to be the love that we want to see in the world, and we have to do it from day one, and we have to insist, and most of us say whatever is part of our spiritual tradition, whatever it is. I would just like us to take it seriously.
I just really want to say thank you. Robbie and I have known each other for a few years, and I've not heard those stories. And, I think living in this country, if you don't have a therapist, I'm being very serious. One of the things that Du Bois talks about is the dual consciousness of folk that are black. I walk into this room, I scan this room. Who is white? Where are the black people sitting? Are they sitting in the front? Are they sitting in the back? Who is speaking? Who's controlling the mic? Where are the exits? Where am I stationed? That's what keeps me alive in white spaces. What privilege does to folk in white-skinned identity is rob you of the opportunity to have that kind of, you just show up. And you show up and oftentimes kind of control the floor and control the flow of traffic, control the mic. And when we're talking about the deconstruction of racism and white supremacy, we're talking about the deconstruction of whiteness. And there's a way that we have all learned to show up. And when I said it's a matter of head and heart, what I've noticed, and once again, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but what I've noticed is that what's come out of, to a certain extent, the Enlightenment period is the separation of the head from the heart. So that when people get emotional, many of us come from cultures where we don't know how to understand it, and we suppress it. Or we have to be perfect. Perfectionism. We have to have all the syntax right, all the words right. We have to be seen a certain kind of way. And when we're talking about the dismantling of white supremacy and racism, it is emotional. It can become confrontational. Folk break down and cry. Other folk don't know how to respond. I mean, we barely know how to respond to a baby crying in the sanctuary on Sunday. Like that's off script. And part of that is what a horrible way to have to live one's life, not leaning into one's full humanity. And so I really want to thank you, Robbie, for sharing that, because we are all on a journey and none of us have arrived, and this thing has impacted us very deeply, and I'm appreciative of you talking about reparations being local. I'll share this story and then I'll shut up, I promise. When we started Resurrected Life Community Church in Allentown, I started when I got out of seminary. I was a newly minted seminarian. I just graduated in 2002. And we had thought about starting a congregation in Allentown. We wanted to be in Center City. We wanted to be in the poorest community in Center City. It was a community that my family came out of. We had saved some money. I think we had about $40,000 in the bank, which was a lot of money for us. We started, around my dining room table. I think our first offering was like $185.25. And so we had some money saved in the bank, and there was a church. There was a church that had declining membership. They had probably about, maybe 6 or 7 people in the congregation, and it was a lot for them to take care of. They put their church up for sale. The average age, I think, was about 85. They came in there for maybe one and a half hours. There was an adjacent educational building. They didn't own a parking lot. The demographics of the community changed. Sounds familiar? But the racial and ethnic makeup of the congregation didn't. So we had went into the church and said, look, we've got some money. We would love to talk to you about, buying your church. And they took us on a tour. They entertained us for a couple of days. And then I got an email that basically said, I don't think you all are going to be able to afford it. So, the church is oil-based, and or the price of oil. So it was all the litmus test, but we don't think you're going to be able. They never asked for the financials. They just said, we don't think you all are going to be able to afford it. So they sold the church. They sold the church facilities. It's about 25,000 square feet. They sold them it was a white church, white congregation. They sold it to white developers for $65,000. 65,000. And we bought the church a year later from the developers for $650,000. That's what I call the price of doing business while you're black. And so I say poetic justice because in that place, we've been able to build a CDC. We've been able to do a freedom school movement in the Lehigh Valley in partnership with the Children's Defense Fund. We have a store for licensed academy that serves 200 children. We're getting ready to break ground on an $8 million renovation. In the midst of the George Floyd situation, we had another church that came and said, we are dissolving, and we can't do what you can do. And they wrote us a check for $300,000 in order to do what they said they couldn't do. And so that was a form of poetic justice for us. In the midst of getting ready to plan this renovation that we're about to do in a couple of months, another church came and said, we're downtown Allentown, beautiful church, 25,000 square feet, the Liberty Bell Church. Some of you may have heard of it. And we'd like to give it to you for $1. And so that's a form of local reparations, and we've told that story and we tell the church that's interesting that the church became known as the Liberty Bell Church for hiding the Liberty Bell in the basement of the church. And while they were hiding the Liberty Bell in the basement of the church, many of them hiding that bell from the British were hiding liberty from my people. And so sometimes it has to come full circle, and sometimes we've got to be patient. We've got to offer each other grace, and it's very clumsy. But I'm a witness that if you engage in the struggle, there is some goodness that comes out of it.
Wow. I'm thinking about us white people, and I'm thinking about what Robbie shared, and we were talking down there a little bit ago about the things that we didn't realize that we're learning about our own lives. At a certain stage of life, you would think it's kind of late for this, which is common for white Americans. I say that, and by the way, I mean, Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania was a sundown city until the 1970s. Lancaster closed its pool too, rather than integrate. But one thing Robbie said that I'd like to think about is he talked about how angry he is about finding out what he didn't know and how he was lied to. I am too. But one thing I'm beginning to think, and if I'm wrong, I want to be corrected and be taught, but I'm starting to really believe it, is that it's not helpful for me to take out my anger from my own experience of white supremacy on other white people. It doesn't move them forward. Can we reach out on the basis of here's the truth about where we live. This is how we're funding schools. This is what's happening with medical care in our community. This is where the waste treatment happens in our community. And present it to people in a way that gives them an opportunity at least to see the truth and respond to it, rather than to drag them through an experience of shame. I'm not saying the shame is inappropriate. I live with it. I heard you say you live with it. I'm saying I'm not sure if we're interested in doing the work of making change, that's the way to go.
What I find interesting about this conversation is that you weren't taught this history, but something moved you to learn it. We live in an age now where we're banning books. School districts are making certain that certain books are not in their libraries. How do we respond to this as faith communities, as leaders in the community, in terms of moving us more to an inclusive understanding of history as critical to healing this nation? If we don't know the history of our peoples, then we have no ability to really address the dynamics of who we are today. So what are your thoughts about how we move that forward as leaders?
You said some stuff earlier.
Yeah, did I?
Yeah, you did.
I don't know. I think one of the reasons why we're fighting over history is because it's so important.
Right.
You know, I think there's only a dozen states that don't have a so-called anti-critical race theory bill that's been introduced in the state legislature. What's that about? It's just about what do we teach our kids about who we are and how we got here. I like to boil it down. That's really what it's about. And why now? Because Baldwin has this great line from I think it's from Fire Next Time where he says, black people don't have the luxury of thinking that our fathers were all freedom-loving heroes, that we always dealt, I'm butchering it, I'm sure, but that we always dealt honorably with the Indian and Mexicans and immigrants, and that everything was rosy and we were all wearing the white hat, essentially. I think about, the history, I got a pretty literally whitewashed, version of that, right? And relearning this more complicated, it's not that all of that was wrong, but man, it's only one piece of the puzzle, here. And so I think it's just absolutely essential so that we have a more honest conversation, that we have again, about who we are, how we got here, why, and just the evidence is all over the place. That's the thing, right? Is that every city in America, of any size, you can look at the racial distribution in the country and see the evidence of redlining, right? This process of forcing white people in one part of the city and forcing everybody else over into these other areas that were always flood zones, pollution zones, right, near industrial areas. Like they're literally not the high ground, in the city. And it's for LA, it's Chicago, it's New York. It's not just like Birmingham, right? It's everywhere. And so I think like that kind of thing that determines all kinds of, in Baltimore, right? The life expectancy, there's a couple, I talked about this in actually the end of White Christian America. There's 2 zip codes in Baltimore. One's predominantly black, one's predominantly white, and the life expectancy of a child born in these zip codes that are 3 miles apart is 20 years different. Right? The white child born 3 miles away, their life expectancy is 20 years more. And if you're comparing countries to the life expectancy of that other zip code that's predominantly black in Baltimore, Yemen is a really close comparison, right? So like that kind of stuff is like right in front of us, right? But if you don't know the history, it just seems, right, like the thing that many white people like to say, oh, well, it's about effort and merit, and, you know, that's how we got here, right? And so black people are there, or Latino people are there because they don't work hard, right? They're lazy, right? That kind of thing. That's the explanation you get in the absence of history, you know? And so I just think it's like, why we're fighting about it is because it's important, right? And why you're getting legislation banning it is because it matters, right, for where we go from here.
We're kind of moving close to the 4:30 hour, and I'm going to ask if you all have maybe some statement that you'd like to make in summation to kind of share, give us a positive thought. About how we go forward.
I can do that. I'm talking about Christians responding to Christian nationalism. Talk about a faith that is not afraid and is not drawing in, but a faith that reaches out to build community with everyone and share the riches of God with everyone. In doing that, you're naming that we have Christian neighbors who are actually constructing a religion of fear and of boundaries. And your opportunity is to talk about the generosity and abundance of God that we see through the ministry of Jesus. And, you know, I could say we can see in the story of Israel as well. In the Christian theological context, talk about the gospel and get clear on what you think it is.
I'll be brief. I think the fact that we're sitting here is a sign of progress. You know, this conversation probably wouldn't be taking place even 10 years ago. So I think the fact that I take this moment of reckoning, I would say, like, as someone who grew up white and Christian, I've never seen this kind of movement and openness to having this conversation in white Christian churches in my lifetime. I was born in 1968. So I take the fact that we are at this moment, I really do think we are at this moment of reckoning. Some of it is about the demographic changes in the country. Some of it is about the hard, long work of activists that have kept this alive, even when the conditions weren't quite right for it. But, you know, I think that the markers that I hear white Christians talking about over and over and again, Dylan Roof, murdering 9 African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015. Charlottesville, 2018, right? The Unite the Right rally, where they were chanting, you know, we're not only rallying around Robert E. Lee, but chanting Jews will not replace us, right? In their khakis and tiki torches, with their tiki torches, you know, and then the movement for Black Lives over the last couple of years, you know. So I think we are at this moment of reckoning. I take that to be a sign of hopefulness, that we're having these conversations in a way that, like, when I was growing up, at least in that world that I was in, it was such a like, the power had it just hermetically sealed. But man, I think the reason why it's a fight is because the cracks are now evident in that edifice, right? But that means it's the time to push, right? And to kind of break that open, right? For the sake of all of us.
Well, I'm going to second what Robbie said, but also say that how great it is that I could be part of the conversation today. Even though I'm not a pastor, even though I'm not from Christian faith, I think it's important, really important to have this conversation, and I'm just really glad to be part of it. And I think I'll just let you know that I'm hearing other people in the community groups that we deal with, and from the Jewish community and other groups, wanting to hear more about what is Christian nationalism and what does it mean, and what does it mean for our community. And I think that's a start of a dialogue about a lot of different issues. So, yeah, I think it's a good thing.
I think we have an incredible opportunity. Crisis always brings opportunity and the opportunity for breakthrough. Our nation is sick. She's been sick a long time. And we are in the hospital, and I think that we have a choice we can make. Are we in the hospital on our way to the morgue? Or are we in the birthing center, and all we have to do is lean in, push, allow ourselves to experience collective discomfort until that narrative of a more perfect union, until the crown of justice begins to show? I'm believing that there's more folk of good faith and moral courage, and that oftentimes the loudest voice is not the last voice. And we have to remember that. The loudest voice is not often the last voice. So I'm grateful for you all being here, and grateful for you, Dr. Pickens, and the Pennsylvania Council of Churches for hosting this incredibly inspiring, challenging, and motivating conversation.
Let's give the panel a hand. I want to also express appreciation to Sandy Strauss, our Director of Public Advocacy. She's in the back there. You've seen her taking cards. Stand up, Sandy. Stand up so we can recognize you. There she is. All right. And let me also recognize Debbie Maglietta, who is our facilities manager at the Pennsylvania Council of Churches, but she's been doing all kinds of stuff that are outside of the building doing work here. So we thank you, Debbie, for your contribution. Is there anything else I need to care for before we close today? We're good? Okay. I'd like to share a few words with you from a meditation that was done by E. Stanley Jones. E. Stanley Jones was a Methodist missionary to India, and back in 1942, he did this meditation on what he called the kingdom of race. And I'm just sharing an excerpt from it. Many of us have the religion of being white, where there is a clash between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of being white. We choose to act upon the fact of race. It is our God. We cannot live abundantly unless we offer ourselves the opportunity to take on the altar of God. Then we can paraphrase Paul and saying, he being in the form of the dominant race, counted it not a thing to be grasped at, but made himself of no reputation, and took on him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men and women. And therefore God has highly exalted them. We have an opportunity to humble ourselves to God's will as we allow God to work with us, with our spirits and our hearts, to make a difference in our communities. And it's our hope today that this conversation has been one step that enables that process. And my prayer is that as we leave this place, that you are buoyed by God's Spirit, that you are overwhelmed by the challenge, and that God continues to create pregnant possibilities that reach into your souls. God bless you and keep you. Amen.